Nama saya Steve Adisa Smith. Sebaiknya saya harus berbahasa Inggris untuk presentasi saya. Maaf ya. And thank you for inviting me to this conference, where we're using digital platforms to share across time and space. So we're literally different sides of the globe and separated by quite a distance in time, and yet we overcome that distance to find a way of sharing ideas and sharing understandings. And that's what I want to talk about in artistic terms, how text and art forms are being shared in new performances in digital modes, in digital technology. In our contemporary world, as we try to understand each other from standpoints in diverse cultures, we face a twofold problem. First, how, in a complex world at a distance, do we achieve effective dynamic understanding of other cultures via their arts, literary and visual? Second is the ethical problem of representation. We have to avoid the two extremes. On the one hand, exclusion, not including representing other cultures in our considerations and studies at all. On the other hand, we represent other cultures, we can represent other cultures in a way that assimilates them, appropriation. So those are the two extremes I'd like to avoid. The problem is especially acute in cases of an imbalance of power between larger dominant communities and smaller scale minority communities. Fortunately, new bridges to understanding are being built. For one thing, all humans have a common neural architecture in psychology. Recent research in cognitive psychology shows that the brain encodes information in interacting narrative and visual form. Goals I'm after and the problems that I want to overcome. So the brain has a common neural architecture. We share narrative and visual forms. Visual art and literature can amplify each other with mutual gain in knowledge transfer and emotional charge. Similarly, right, there's the transfer of information through digital technology. The internet can open door to unprecedented intercultural exchanges. New media, the integration of artistic performances, allows us to better address the true problems of understanding and ethics. Various indigenous cultures now are performing their own stories, illustrated with their own art, to share a dynamic understanding of their voices and visions as participants in the world. So I'm going to illustrate this today by showing you a clip from an indigenous Maori performance of one of their traditional tales, Maui Chiki Chiki Ataranga, translated in English as How Maui Found His Mother. My own background, I come from comparative literature, which traditionally focused primarily on text. There's a Sanskrit text in Devanagari, transliteration, and then translation into English. So this field realized literature as an art form, and you wanted to try to get a full understanding of it, right? And when you're going at a distance culturally and in terms of language, there's always an issue of translation and context and understanding. The context, on the one hand, in order to understand something, you have to understand the context. But when you're removed in time or cultural distance, then context can be a problem, right? So if you decontextualize it and you don't understand it in terms that are equivalent to the way the original community would have understood it, then you've misunderstood it, misrepresented it. Hans Georg Gadamer came up with this idea of horizons of understanding that were always, the way he conceived it is we're trying to fuse horizons as we communicate and understand more and more. Another hermeneutical philosopher, Paul Ricoeur, understood it as the expansion of horizons that are always growing and spreading. Ricoeur has a concept he calls the hermeneutical function of distanciation, and he points out that texts, first of all, are a break with the dynamism of phenomenon, so phenomenology, events in the world. You take the events in the world and you create an artificial expression, a text, a literary work. It's an ensemble of signs, but it is not the world itself, and yet it has to relate somehow to the world itself, or it's meaningless. And then the reader approaches this text, and they have to read it and make sense of it. Again, there's a distance that's involved there, and they make sense of it in terms of their own experience. But the effort to overcome that distance, Ricoeur argues, is a productive one, because you get distance from yourself, some perspective on yourself, and that allows you to understand yourself better. So you emerge from the act of reading with a better self-understanding. So the other thing that changed my understanding of text and getting to know the context of ancient India, I studied in India for a short while, they were quite comfortable with representing stories in artistic form. For example, in sculptures and friezes. There are thousands of examples from across India, especially during the Gupta Empire, classical India. On the left is the representation of a scene of Draupadi and the five Pandava brothers from the Shavatar temple. Gupta Empire was a cosmopolitan international empire. You would know it in Indonesia because they had trading relationships with Sriwijaya in the southeast. Borobudur, the temple in Java, has similar carvings depicting the life of the Buddha. So the idea that stories can be told in visual form, stories need to be visualized to be understood, and iconography has a narrative aspect to it. Those two have been intermingled for a long time. It's not just in ancient South Asia, Southeast Asia, it's also around the world. So for example, the Mayan Popol Vuh, this is the Codex Dresden here. The script of Mayan is already intensely pictographic to begin with, and they call the Popol Vuh a vision book, and you would open it and there would be illustrations accompanying every episode. Another example from medieval Ireland, the Book of Kells, is illustrating stories from the Gospels with rich illustration of the letters themselves, turning them into the letters into pieces of art, and illustrations of the scenes that are going on to the side. This is not a new idea, in other words. What is new is our understanding of how it works. So I've been trying to keep abreast of recent developments in cognitive neuroscience over the past few decades. And a particular work that bears on literature is Dehaan's Reading in the Brain. And this is what he points out is involved. Not the old, the top picture there has an older understanding, very linear and very simple. Now they know, and they can trace what happens as you read and understand. It goes from the visual perceptions of letters to the letterbox of the brain, or if you're hearing a story, it could be auditory perception of sounds and have a different starting point. But then from both, it passes to the places where sound images are stored in the brain, the phonic areas, the place where meanings are stored, the semantic areas, and then in less than a second, triggers other centers. Motor systems that get your heart beating and send your blood rushing as you read an engaging story. The mirror neuron systems that allow you to represent the actions of others in yourself as though you're doing them yourself, right? Which may have implications for empathy. The visual, ethical, social models, the modules, those parts are interlinked. We visualize faces, social information, and our ethical judgments are being processed through that area, as well as the left hemisphere, the rational ordering parts of the brain. All of that is involved in every aspect of reading, and of course it's involved every time there's a performance of any other art as well. There's a new field in media psychology is also looking at how storytelling affects the brain, and they can trace this now, what's going on. It opens up a new understanding. So more is now known about visual, textual, and narrative processing in the brain than ever before. That's a picture of Stanislas Dehaan. He's from Collège de France and has a neuroimaging project. He studied how mathematics is processed in the brain, the number sense, how literacy is processed there, reading in the brain, awareness itself, consciousness in the brain. And most recently this year came out with a new book, How We Learn, and he talked about 4 pillars of learning. These are brain processes, neural processes that are involved in all learning for all people in the planet, right on the planet. Gaining and holding attention is the first. Active engagement, you've got to work through it in some way. Feedback and error correction is another, and integration or consolidation is a fourth. Of particular note to us of interest for literature and visual arts, the two together are trying to grab the attention. They don't work unless they do, and visuals are very good for that, getting attention. Active engagement, working through, especially if you have more than one mode going on at the same time. So you're reading the text or hearing a spoken tale and looking at the pictures as they dynamically unfold. And this all helps with consolidation, with the integration at the end, bringing the two together. So there are new tools and new understandings that are emerging, that's all to the good. The ethical problems still remain, right? The ethics of representation. And I mentioned this before, the two polar opposites, exclusion and appropriation. So what I mean, to expand on that a bit, right? This is an incredibly diverse world, right? Over 7,000 different languages that are still around. If we lose touch with that, we've lost, it's a tremendous loss, right? The perspectives and experiences of all those different people are not part of our understanding or our studies. If those people are not representing themselves, however, then that's also an ethical problem. These are their artistic creations. These are their story traditions. And that is the, so if all that's excluded, it's just a loss. If we include it in the wrong way, that's the second problem, appropriation. It can amount to cultural theft, right? That you're taking from them. Or you misrepresent because you misunderstand what's going on. You hide behind a mask. It's a kind of imposture, right? Rather than a performance, it's an imposture. Now, I say those are two polar extremes. There's lots of creative ground in the middle. And one potential solution that has arisen is collaborative performance. Performances that draw on different people from different cultural standpoints, and they together offer a new understanding. And that's, I'm going to give you an example of this. In order to make that point, though, I want you to experience the opposite, the text alone, and told in a problematic way. So the tale of Maui, right, the Polynesian trickster figure, and I'm focusing on his Maori representation, his Maori version, very famous, has become more famous recently because of some movie. This is the story of his birth and his childhood, his homecoming. And it was collected by W.D. Westervelt in 1910, right, Legends of Maui. And to give Westervelt credit, he was a serious folklorist from the U.S. He went to the Pacific and he collected all the Polynesian tales he could, and knew there were many different versions, and gathered a lot of them together, and all that's to the good. On the other hand, he was a Christian missionary, that's his standpoint, and he had a rather diminished view of what these tales were about. This, by the way, is the version that's most often taught in American universities here in the U.S., and this is why it's problematic. He thought the stories of Maui were the rude mythical survival, this is a quote, of an era without religion or civil government, when every man was a law unto himself. So in this version, this is the entire story that he gives. It is not the entire traditional Maori story, by the way. It's a reduced version. But let's look at it. Maui was prematurely born, his mother not caring to be troubled with him, cut off a lock of her hair, tied it around him, cast him in the sea. So the mother doesn't care at all. She's not even named, by the way. It's not worth naming. And she just doesn't want to be troubled and throws her baby out into the ocean like you do with a premature child, right? In this way, his name came to him, Maui Chiki Chiki, Maui formed in the top knot. The waters bore him safely. The jellyfish enwrapped him and mothered him. So his mother didn't care for him, but the jellyfish mothered him. The unnamed god of the seas cared for and protected him, was carried to the god's house, hung up on the roof, and he was cherished into life by the warmth of the fire. Right? No mention of a community. The other figures, the people who are there, the gods, aren't named. No mention of his childhood, just simply when he was old enough, he came to his relations, no mention of the journey there, while they were all gathered in the great house of assembly, dancing and making merry. Now there's a hint of a community behind this, a hint of their culture and artistic traditions. They have a house of assembly where they meet. There's a dance that they perform, but that's it. It's just a hint. Little Maui crept in, and he has to creep in, and sat down behind his brothers. As soon as mother called the children, found a strange child who had to prove he was her son, and then he was taken in. Okay, that is, and that's it. That is the entire story that Westervelt reports. Now let me introduce you to the more recent, in fact, a century later, 2010, the Maori television told their version of this story as a collaborative effort. And I'm going to show you a small section of it. It's from a longer series called Maui Chipua. The traditional Maori legend was retold in English by an author who had links and roots in the Maori community. He wasn't Maori himself, but he married a Maori woman, and he had links there, and he was in collaboration with Maori artists, and he worked their art forms into his book. And this is an example of his form. He did this as a children's book, and he incorporates elements of their visual arts, right? The flowing lines, the spirals, the internested triangles. More on those later. So they took this retelling and then they did a further retelling. A Maori narrator and storyteller back translated it into Maori, so you'll hear that in a second. The person is Mary Penfold. She did that. The tale itself is decisively placed in Maori communities and showcases their way of life. The result is a new Maori performance, proudly broadcast on Maori television. The story is more humane and communal, and I would argue more engaging. I'm going to show you the second half of the tale after Maui's found on the beach by his uncle Ranga. As you watch, note the artistic style of flowing lines, spiral korus. Koru is a firm curl. You'll see examples. The spiral is a very developed example. You'll see more in the video.
Tōna matua ke ka whiu-whiua ngā karare he mui-muia. Ka Maui hoki te tākai tiki-tiki, ka hurakina. Ka ore I mōhio, ko ia nei ko Maui o tana ira matu. A hakoa, nā te aroha, hari ana ki te kāira, hei tamaiti whāngai māka. Ka tupu ake a Maui ka rongo. Ka mōhio I a tamanui ki te rangi, ki ngā kōrero, mō rangi rāua ko papa, mō tiki rāua ko tū, me ngā tikanga kōrero mō te mautaiaha. Nāna hoki ngā kōrero mō te ao tūroa, te aroha, me ngā tikanga maha, ā me pēhea hoki te mau, te tohu, me te tiaki. Ka kama te kapo tika ngā Māori, kua rawe ki te whakamanu iaia, ko rupe, te kerero, te tino manu. I tētahi rā, huri kau ana hei kereru, ka rere ki te wākainga o te hapu. E kō, e kari ana rātai I te māra tūna. Kua maua Maui ki te kō, a kari me te haere o te karakia. Ko tahi tonu te kari a te hungara, o tino a te mahiga. He rawe tonu te ao o Maui, iaia e tupu ake ana. Nā, pa ki te ake, he whaia o ona hoki. Nā, ka pātai hoki, kei hea tō.
Oi rā tōku whaia, taku mōhio ko tāranga. Kei hea ia, kei hea rawa atu. Ta whikirawa māku ki te kawe I a koe. Kei te pai, māku anō ia e kimi.
Ko ia anō tērā, he roa ia e kimi ana. Nā, ka tūpono iho, ki tana pā o mua. He hui I te pā. Nā ka tata atu a Maui, ka kite atu, I tētahi wahine, e mihi ana ki ana tama. Ka pai tonga atu a Maui, o ia, tōna whaia. Takitahi tonu te hongi haere a te wahine rā I ana tama. Ka whakatata tonu atu a Maui, tū ana I muri au I ona tuakara. Ka tae mai ki a Maui, ka umere te tangi a tārana. Auwe, hoi koe, ko Maui pōtiki tō tama mutunga. Nā, ka kōrero atu ki tana whaia, mai I tana whiunga e tāranga ki te tai moana. Pupu ana te roimata I ngā kamo o tāranga, I te hari, I te koa me te aroha. Ko ia hoki, tana pekepuku.
So, notice the way the tale integrates flowing lines and spiral designs with a focus on the community, and its narrative even becomes kind of a spiral. Now, I didn't show the opening of the tale, but Maui's mother sadly gave him up because he was apparently stillborn, and with a prayer consigned him to the waves after lovingly bundling Maui in her hair. The baby is nourished by the elements, but they're drawn with a flowing Maori lineation depicted as loving natural forces, each is personified with a face decorated with kaumoko tattoos. Maui is found and saved by his uncle Ranga, arrayed as a traditional Maui elder. Ranga inducts Maui as a boy into Maori culture, teaching him how to relate to nature, spiritual forces, how to perform as a member of Maui society. Even one of Maui's trademarks, magic powers, shapeshifting, is brought back into service for the community when his cooing as a pigeon transforms into a work song that unites the men in their collaborative effort. The pas, or communities, are linked with arrays of triangles to depict the closeness of the community, and they're drawn in traditional colors of black, red, and white, which symbolize potential becoming full being. There's a whole philosophy in there. This narrative poem unfolds in growth and progress, with Maui gaining power before curling back to his home pa. As a young man, Maui desires to reconnect with his mother and birth family. He heroically journeys to her community. Still a trickster, he slips back into the family lineup. But after declaring his identity, it is Maui's own narrative that reconnects him to his mother. There's a moment of mutual recognition and a joyful, tearful reunion sealed with a hongi. That's the down here, like the nose-to-nose mingling of breath. Maui reconnects with both his mother and their community. The tale now is a visual artistic performance. It spirals out from Maui's mother, flowing with the ocean waves, gains power at the periphery with his uncle, and then spirals back to his home, which becomes his base for further adventures, a narrative horu. So since this is now in this form, I was able to share it during the COVID crisis with my students in the US. And rather than relying on a story told by an outsider who had diminished it and dehumanized it, really, they get a much richer sense of what's going on. They have an encounter with spoken voice, traditional arts, visual arts, and the engaging narrative. This multimodal presentation amplifies the meaning. It's an enriched text and art form, and I would argue a new art form. The interweaving of text and of visuals creates a new kind of experience. When I say new, it's new because of the digital technology and the form it takes. It's actually fulfilling a dream of ancient India, of classical Sanskrit, the dream of a total performance. So, for example, the plays in classical India are called Drishya Kavya, visual literature, poems that are to be seen. They combine actors, dancers, music, mime, dialogue, and poems. And we're now returning to that kind of idea in these new digital forms. It's a new kind of experience. Like raw phenomenal experience, several modes of information are drawn together to create a coherent experience in the brain. They function similarly to what C.S. Peirce called interpretance, a sign that is developed by another sign so it becomes more meaningful. Now, Peirce, being in the hard sciences and a mathematician, talked about dynamic objects, and he tended to have a more schematic view of what was going on. I approach more from phenomenology and therefore talk about dynamic events. Human experience is complex, and the events we go through call for interpretation and expression, and those are an interweaved brand. And what you have in this new integrated performance is a kind of artistic interpretant, right? It's integrating all these different forms and creating a new virtual experience. That virtual experience helps us to overcome the distance in time and space, distance culturally. We join together and collaborate in speaking and listening, in trying to understand. And another benefit is that as a digital form, it can be stored so that we can experience it later, just like you're going to experience this talk hours later after I've given it. So it's a new time, right? Sharing arts and narratives for cross-cultural understanding. Text, visuals, music, and other art forms are generating a virtual experience of unfolding process. The performance of culture, or rather culture as synchronized performance and mutual understanding. Thank you very much for listening and for allowing me to present to you. Sampai jumpa.
Thank you, Dr. Steve, for the presentation. So, if if you if you are here, then would like to say